This Sunday on Meet the Press, my exclusive interview with President Obama on the ISIS threat.
The next phase is now to start going on some offense.
On why he's delaying action on immigration.
When I take executive action, I want to make sure that it's sustainable.
On the political fight.
Give me a loyal opposition that has some common sense.
And struggling with the theatrics of the presidency.
It's not something that always comes naturally to me.
Plus, who needs Washington? Cities around the country are making significant change. I'll ask three mayors what they're doing right and what Washington needs to learn. And the battle for the Senate. New exclusive poll numbers that remind us just when we think we know what's going on, everything can change.
It's a packed Sunday. I'm Chuck Todd, and joining me to provide insight and analysis are NBC's Joe Scarborough, Nia Malika Henderson of The Washington Post, NBC's Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, NBC National Security Analyst Michael Leiter. I got BuzzFeed's John Stanton, and Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press.
And good morning. Obviously, it's a pretty big honor for me to be sitting in this chair as the 12th moderator of the program, following in the footsteps of the likes of Martha Roundtree, Lawrence Spivak, Tim Russert, and of course, David Gregory. And as you can see, we're making a few changes around here. As I like to say, we're living in a house as we remodel it, so the program in this studio will continue to evolve over the coming months. But what better way to start off my first show than with an exclusive sit-down with the President of the United States.
To say it's been a long, hot summer for President Obama is quite an understatement. The brutal rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria and their execution of 2 American journalists triggered U.S. airstrikes in Iraq. And the president invited criticism when he made this frank admission.
We don't have a strategy yet.
More criticism came when he went golfing shortly after condemning James Foley's murder. All this contributing to a sense the world is spinning out of the president's control. At home, the president's approval ratings have hit all-time lows, and many Democrats are desperate to distance themselves from the White House.
Chuck.
All this hanging over his head, yesterday I sat down with the president in the cabinet room of the White House.
Mr. President, welcome back to your 12th appearance on Meet the Press.
Great to see you.
Thanks for doing this. We start with a very basic question. Are you preparing the country to go back to war?
I'm preparing the country to make sure that we deal with a threat from ISIL. Keep in mind, this is something that we know how to do. We've been dealing with terrorist threats for quite some time. This administration has systematically dismantled al-Qaeda and the Fatah. ISIL poses a broader threat because of its territorial ambitions in Iraq and Syria. But the good news is, coming back from the most recent NATO meeting, is the entire international community understands that this is something that has to be dealt with. So what I have done over the last several months is, first and foremost, make sure that we got eyes on the problem, that we shifted resources, intelligence, reconnaissance. We did an assessment on the ground. The second step was to make sure that we protected American personnel, our embassies, our consulates. That included taking airstrikes to ensure that towns like Erbil were not overrun, critical infrastructure like the Mosul Dam was protected, and that we were able to engage in key humanitarian assistance programs that have saved thousands of lives. The next phase is now to start going on some offense. We have to get an Iraqi government in place, and I'm optimistic that next week we should be able to get that done. And I will then meet with congressional leaders on Tuesday. On Wednesday, I'll make a speech and describe what our game plans are going to be going forward. But this is not going to be an announcement about U.S. ground troops. This is not the equivalent of the Iraq War. What this is similar to the kinds of counterterrorism campaigns that we've been engaging in consistently over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And the good news is that because of American leadership, we have, I believe, a broad-based coalition internationally and regionally to be able to deal with the problem.
What are you asking of the American people on Wednesday? You say you're giving a speech. That's the type of thing, I assume, you're preparing the country for something. What are you asking of them?
More than anything, I just want the American people to understand the nature of the threat and how we're going to deal with it, and to have confidence that we'll be able to deal with it.
You realize you're giving that speech the day before the 13th anniversary of 9/11.
But right, and I want everybody to understand that we have not seen any immediate intelligence about threats to the homeland from ISIL. That's not what this is about. What it's about is an organization that, if allowed to control significant amounts of territory, to amass more resources, more arms, to attract more foreign fighters, including from areas like Europe, who have Europeans who have visas and then can travel to the United States unimpeded, that over time that can be a serious threat to the homeland. So what I'm going to be asking the American people to understand is, number one, this is a serious threat. Number two, we have the capacity to deal with it. Here's how we're going to deal with it. I am going to be asking Congress to make sure that they understand and support what our plan is. And it's going to require some resources, I suspect, above what we are currently doing in the region.
This is asking Congress for a vote, an authorization of your strategy. This is not a, what does that mean?
Well,
Define that.
I'm confident that I've got the authorization that I need to protect the American people. And I'm always going to do what's necessary to protect the American people. But I do think it's important for Congress to understand what the plan is, to have buy-in, to debate it. And that's why we've been consulting with Congress throughout. This speech will allow Congress, I think, to understand very clearly and very specifically what it is that we are doing, but also what we're not doing. We're not looking at sending in 100,000 American troops. We are going to be, as part of an international coalition, carrying out airstrikes in support of work on the ground by Iraqi troops, Kurdish troops. We are going to be helping to put together a plan for them so that they can start retaking territory that ISIL had taken over. What I want people to understand, though, is that over the course of months, we are going to be able to not just blunt the momentum of ISIL, we are going to systematically degrade their capabilities. We're going to shrink the territory that they control. And ultimately, we're going to defeat them.
Long way from when you described them as a JV team.
Well,
was that bad intelligence or your misjudgment?
Keep in mind, I wasn't specifically referring to ISIL. I've said that regionally, there were a whole series of organizations that were focused primarily locally, weren't focused on the homeland, because I think a lot of us, when we think about terrorism, the model is Osama bin Laden and 9/11. And the point that I was...
You don't believe these people...
Not yet, but they can evolve. And I was very specific at that time. What I said was, not every regional terrorist organization is automatically a threat to us that would call for a major offensive. Our goal should not be to think that we can occupy every country where there is a terrorist organization.
You've not said the word Syria so far in our conversation. Obviously, if you're going to defeat ISIS, you have used very much stronger language. It's gone through the week during your trip to Wales. You got to go to Syria in some form or another. You've ruled out boots on the ground. And I'm curious, have you only ruled them out simply for domestic political reasons, or is there another reason you've ruled out American boots on the ground? Because your own guys have said you can't defeat ISIS with airstrikes alone.
Well, they're absolutely right about that. But you also cannot, over the long term or even the medium term, deal with this problem by having the United States serially occupy various countries all around the Middle East. We don't have the resources. It puts enormous strains on our military. And at some point we leave and then things blow up again.
Well, that's what happened with Iraq.
So we've got to have a more sustainable strategy, which means the boots on the ground have to be Iraqi.
What about
in
Syria?
And in Syria, the boots on the ground have to be Syrian. And that's why...
Who?
Well, we have a Free Syrian Army and a moderate opposition that we have steadily been working with, that we have vetted. They have been on the defensive, not just from ISIL, but also from the Assad regime. The strategy, both for Iraq and for Syria, is that we will hunt down ISIL members and assets wherever they are. I will reserve the right to always protect the American people and go after folks who are trying to hurt us wherever they are. But in terms of controlling territory, we're going to have to develop a moderate Sunni opposition that can control territory and that we can work with. The notion that the United States should be putting boots on the ground, I think, would be a profound mistake, and I want to be very clear and very explicit about that.
I got a somewhat snarky email from a casual viewer who said, the United States gives a lot of military aid to Saudi Arabia. It's about time they use it. What do you say to them?
Well, I think that it is absolutely true that we're going to need Sunni states to step up. Not just Saudi Arabia, our partners like Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Turkey. They need to be involved. This is their neighborhood. The dangers that are posed are more directed at them right now than they are us. And the good news is, I think, for perhaps the first time, you have absolute clarity that the problem for Sunni states in the region, many of whom are our allies, is not simply Iran. It's not simply a Sunni-Shia issue. Sunni extremism, as represented by ISIL, is the biggest danger that they face right now.
Assad, we're essentially putting aside that priority that Assad must go because ISIS is a more direct threat.
You know, the reason we're in this situation is because Assad brutalized his people and specifically brutalized a Sunni population that is the majority in Syria. It's going to be hard for us to attract Sunnis to fight against ISIL in this area if they think that we're doing it on behalf of Assad. So our attitude towards Assad continues to be that through his actions, through using chemical weapons on his own people, dropping barrel bombs that kill innocent children, that he has foregone legitimacy. But when it comes to our policy and the coalition that we're putting together, our focus specifically is on ISIL.
Part one of my interview there. Some of you may have noted that I said the president hadn't mentioned the word Syria at all in one of my questions. He had mentioned it, but he hadn't said whether he was taking military action there. Let me get a little bit of reaction here. Joe, Nia, Andrea, and Mike Leiter are here. Mike, let me start with you, former head of the Counterterrorism Center. Is that a president that now is getting briefing from, your successor now and that believes those briefings?
He believes that they are a threat regionally. I don't think they see this as a homeland threat to the same degree that they should. The fact is...
You think he's downplaying the 9/11 threat too much?
I think they can transition much more quickly than we might detect from a regional threat to a threat to the homeland. And what we do know, as he talked about, we've defeated organizations before, Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. It has to include the offense, and that has to be in Syria.
Right.
You can't get around that, and that's the long pole in the tent.
Okay, we talked about Saudi Arabia. He brought up he wants this moderate Sunni. John Kerry, your beat, is traveling all there this week. Is that going to happen?
It's going to take a while because you can't totally roll back. You can't, in fact, roll back what happened for 3 years. Yeah. The Saudis and others in the region are very upset. They're angry. They don't trust this president to go after Assad because he didn't. And he is basically saying he's outlining a war against ISIL in Iraq based on an Iraqi army that has yet to be proved effective at all. So if you're only going to fight them in Iraq, degrade them in Iraq, and then worry about Syria with the Syrian Free Army that we let down for 3 years, we have not armed them to their needs. How does that work? So it's a strategy. It's the clearest strategy. This was an incredible interview in that he's laying it out point by point.
It does. I feel like this is a long way from I don't yet have a strategy yet.
No, he's got the strategy.
Yeah.
The question now will be, will it work?
Obviously, we refer to it at NBC News as ISIS. The Obama administration president says the word ISIL. The last S stands for Syria. The last L they don't want to have stand for Syria. Joe, he's going to give a speech. American public. What does he need to say, do you think, that will rally the public to his strategy?
I think he laid it out pretty well. I mean, we have to remember, you look at the polls, and 6 months ago, 3 months ago, the American people said they didn't want to get involved. They didn't want a hyperactive foreign policy. We are an exhausted nation. And I think this president's taking a fairly reasoned, measured response. Now, we obsess.
Do you think he's been too poll-driven about it? Do you wonder that?
No, I don't.
Do you think that's why he delayed his action?
I don't think he's been poll-driven enough for a lot of Democratic senators who this past week started breaking, and suddenly they're sounding a lot more like John McCain.
Yes, they are.
Than you would expect Democratic senators to sound. But we obsess over things like the JV team, which I obsess over. Everybody, we all do. The brown suit. I don't have a strategy yet. The American people aren't there. It's about safety. It's about security. And again, this president's taking a fairly measured approach. And that's not only where Democrats are, that's where a lot of conservatives are.
Seems like a pretty serious guy. So this vote in Congress. He's asking for a vote. It's interesting. Not authorization, he says, but he wants him to basically thumbs up or thumbs down on his plan. That's what he's asking for. How's that vote going to go?
Yeah, I mean, he talked about a buy-in, right? He didn't specifically say authorization. He said he had that authorization.
By the way, buy-in really is funding.
Yes,
let's remember what that really is.
He talked a little bit about resources, right? And that's exactly what I was on the Hill last week, and it looks like this Congress is looking at this next 2 weeks where they're on the Hill as a sort of a lame duck period, right? And trying to do the bare minimum. So that might be what he faces going forward, and he is also facing a Congress that might not want to go forward on an authorization.
Let's see what's going on in November.
That's
happening in 2 weeks. Do these guys?
It's the first week in October.
They are. It'll be interesting. Do they really want to use September to debate?
But they do. They have scheduled hearings for the 16th of September.
And there's a vote. Bill Nelson's going to put forward a bill as well on this authorization. So we'll see.
All right. Well, we now know what our September is going to be about. It's about ISIS, both abroad and here. Thank you, Andrea and Michael, for being here. My national security gurus, Joe and Nia, are sticking around. We got a lot more of the president's interview. Taking some heat for delaying the executive action on immigration. Where do you hear how he tries to explain why politics wasn't behind it? And then there's Ebola. He says the U.S. has no choice but to take charge.
There's the prospect then that the virus mutates, it becomes more easily transmittable, and then it could be a serious danger to the United States.
Meet the Press is brought to you by BDO. People who know BDO.
And welcome back. This morning's New York Times says this: given the world's weakness on Ebola, that the United States needs to take the lead. Well, in the second part of my exclusive interview with President Obama, I asked him about that, as well as his decision to delay executive action on immigration till after the election.
Let me go to immigration. You made a decision to delay any executive action till after the election. What do you tell the person that's going to get deported before the election that this decision was essentially made in your hopes of saving a Democratic Senate?
Well, that's not the reason. A couple of things that I want to say about immigration. Number one, I have been consistent about why this is important. The country is going to be better off if we have an immigration system that works, that has strong border security, that has streamlined our legal immigration system, so the best and the brightest who want to stay here and invest here and create jobs here can do so, that families can be unified, and that a system where the millions of people who are here in many cases for a decade or more, who have American kids, who are neighbors, oftentimes are our friends, that they have a path to get legal by paying taxes and getting above board, paying a fine, learning English if they have to. So the good news is we have bipartisan support for that. We have a Senate bill that would accomplish that. The House Republicans refused to do it, and what I said to them was, if you do not act on something that's so common sense that you got labor, business, evangelicals, law enforcement, you got folks across the board supporting it, then I'm going to look for all the legal authorities I have to act. I want to make sure we get it right. I want to make sure, number one, that all the T's are crossed.
Looks like politics. I mean, it looks like election year politics.
Not only do I want to make sure that the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, but here's the other thing, Chuck, and I'm being honest now, about the politics of it. This problem with unaccompanied children that we saw a couple of weeks ago, where you had from Central America a surge of kids who were showing up at the border, got a lot of attention. And a lot of Americans started thinking, we've got this immigration crisis on our hands. And what I want to do is, when I take executive action, I want to make sure that it's sustainable. I want to make sure
the public's
that
not behind you. You're
right
not taking it. It sounds a little bit like you're concerned the public wouldn't support what you did.
What I'm saying is that I'm going to act because it's the right thing for the country, but it's going to be more sustainable and more effective if the public understands what the facts are on immigration, what we've done on unaccompanied children, and why it's necessary.
Ebola. There's some anxiety in the country about it. Obviously, it's something that Africa's trying to get its hands around, but there's obviously anxiety in the United States. Yeah. How concerned are you, and how concerned should Americans be?
Well, Americans shouldn't be concerned about the prospects of contagion here in the United States short term, because this is not an airborne disease.
I noticed you said short term, though.
Well, I'm going to get to that. It's not an airborne disease like the flu. You can only catch it through the transmission of bodily fluids. The problem that we've got is in, right now, a limited portion of Western Africa. So what I've said, and I said this 2 months ago to our national security team, is we have to make this a national security priority.
It's going to be a U.S.-led effort.
As usual. And we're going to have to get U.S. military assets just to set up, for example, isolation units and equipment there to provide security for public health workers surging from around the world. If we do that, then it's still going to be months before this problem is controllable in Africa, but it shouldn't reach our shores. Now, here's the last point I'm going to make. If we don't make that effort now, and this spreads not just through Africa, but other parts of the world, there's the prospect then that the virus mutates, it becomes more easily transmittable, and then it could be a serious danger to the United States.
What's the rationale for this election? I'm going to be a little cynical here. $3 billion, I would argue, is being decided to see if it's Harry Reid or Mitch McConnell that's in charge of gridlock in the Senate. I mean, we're talking either, what's the difference between a 2-seat Democratic majority and a 2-seat Republican majority as far as your agenda is concerned?
First of all, there's a sharp difference between the Democratic agenda and the Republican agenda. And the American people need to know that. If you've got a Democratic Senate, that means bills are being introduced to raise the minimum wage. That's something Democrats support. We think America needs a raise.
Where's that on your desk?
I'll get to that. Equal pay for equal work. We care about that. The Republicans, that's not their priority. We think it's important to make sure that issues like family leave and family-friendly policies and more effective child care are in place so that folks are getting help, that young people are getting more assistance when it comes to paying for college educations, rebuilding our infrastructure, putting folks back to work on our roads, our bridges, all of which would boost our economy now and boost it into the future. On all those issues, there is a sharp contrast. Now, it is true that if the House stays Republican, that it's unlikely that I get a lot of these bills to my desk. But it makes a big difference if we've got at least one branch in Congress that is presenting these ideas, making arguments. I know that, given the gridlock that we've seen over the last couple of years, it's easy to say that these midterms don't matter, but the fact of the matter is that on every issue that's important to middle-class Americans, overwhelmingly we're seeing a majority prefer the Democratic option, and us having a Democratic Senate that can present those issues and put them forward, just like they did on immigration, even if the House Republicans fail to act, means that we're debating the right stuff for the country. We're debating the things that are going to help us grow.
This wouldn't be Meet the Press if I didn't have a chart with me. Your year of action on the State of the Union.
Yeah.
And it's a little small here. It'll be bigger for the television viewers.
Yeah, you're going to make it a bigger.
I will. Yeah, there you go. A lot not accomplished here. The one thing about in your State of the Union, supporting Syrian rebels is there. But immigration, overhauling the tax system, raising the minimum wage. You brought up the issues yourself.
Exactly.
That was with a Democratic Senate. So that's why you look at this and you sit there and say, how does things change? And do you think your presidency's in bigger trouble then if you have a Republican Senate?
I think elections matter. I think votes matter. And given the fact that the punditry overwhelmingly felt that this was going to be...
You're overly pointing at me.
that this was going to be a good year for Senate Republicans because the seats that were up were in states that were tilting or significantly with significant Republican majorities. If Democrats hold the Senate, I think that should get Republicans to once again.
I think that sends a national message.
I think what it does is to send a message to Republicans that people want to get stuff done, that their strategy of just obstructing and saying no to every piece of legislation that might help middle-class families, that might create ladders of opportunity for people, that is an agenda that the American people reject. And that then gives us room, hopefully, to find some compromises. Look, I've said this before, Chuck. You know, if you ask me back in August what I want for my birthday, I'd say give me a loyal opposition that has some common sense and is willing to work on some basic issues that didn't used to be partisan issues.
Well, for more reaction on the domestic portion of my interview there, Joe and Nia are back. John Stanton of BuzzFeed is here because we didn't have enough goatees on the table.
There you go.
On the desk for the first time as well. And Amy Walter, of course, of the Cook Political Report. Joe, let me quickly start with you. You just made a comment off camera. Make it on camera. What you just said, you thought you've heard deja vu all over again.
I'm surprised. I think the president's more engaged than he's been engaged. I've been watching and saying, you know what, this guy looks like he's finally getting re-energized and he's ready to play. But then I hear him say, well, you know, if we win this time, then this time Republicans are going to get the message they have to work with us. He had said that to me in 2012 before the election. And he said, well, if we win this time, then they'll understand that I'm legitimate and da-da-da. And I said, well, Bill Clinton got reelected and we impeached him the second time.
Is that what you're headed? Yeah, I know.
That's not where I'm headed. But the idea that if Republicans don't win this time, that suddenly they're going to play ball isn't the answer. The answer is figuring out the way you figure it out. And is that how do you come to a deal with these guys on issues that matter?
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.